a research professor at the Internet Interdisciplinary Institute of the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya in Barcelona, where she also leads the Global Literary Studies Research Lab. Globals, I guess, is your acronym. She is a leading scholar in cultural history, translation studies, and digital humanities, widely known for her work on transnational literary circulation and the role of translation and publishing networks in shaping modern European and global cultures. Today's talk speaks directly to these long-standing concerns, and we're delighted to have her with us today, where she'll be talking to us on the topic of digital humanities, methods, and translation history. Dr. Roig-Sanz, Diana, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Stuart, for your kind presentation and also for having invited me to give this lecture. And ni hao, everyone. I would wish I could say some more words in Chinese, but unfortunately, my expertise is very low. So I'm going to share my presentation and I will explain to you a little bit how I have prepared this seminar for today. So, can you see my full screen?
Yeah. Not yet.
No, not
actually.
yet. Okay, let me try again. Okay, now.
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Yeah. Okay. Wait a minute. I'm going to try to hide this because it's at the middle of my screen. And okay, so as Stuart was explaining to you, I've been working for a long time in translation and more specifically in translation history, but also I've been working also for a very long time on digital humanities and on data-driven approaches applied to translation and to literary studies. So just to maybe to explain to you a little bit my background, because I guess that many of you come from very different backgrounds. So I had my undergraduate was in literature, and I was working in the University of Barcelona at that time. And then I pursued a PhD by the University of Barcelona and also by the University of Aix-en-Provence, Marseille in literary studies. And then in my postdoctoral phase, I was working with historians and sociologists. And it was at that time at the École Normale Supérieure when I got interested in quantitative approaches. So this is to say that in my undergraduate, I was a more traditional literary scholar working with text. And then during my postdoctoral phase, I got interested in these quantitative and statistical approaches. Then I thought that it was good to apply them in literary studies and in translation studies, and this is why I decided to train myself at the KU11 because there is a very strong department in translation studies, and the summer school, the oldest summer school in translation studies nowadays, the Center for Translation Studies, at the KU11, and I have the pleasure of being one of the international teaching staff from 2022 onwards. And then I went to the Oxford Internet Institute as a visiting scholar already in 2017, so almost 10 years ago, because I was already working on digital humanities, and I thought that it was good for me to combine this expertise in literature, in translation, with a deeper training in the age. And then I applied for an ICREA grant, that this is the most important grants that you can get from the European Research Council. And I got an ERC project, and I will talk about this a little bit later. And this ERC project was fully into DH and also in translation history. And last year, I was also invited by the Barcelona Supercomputing Center as a visiting scholar in the department that they have already started 2 years ago on social sciences and the humanities, computing social sciences and the humanities. So this is to show how someone like me, who was initially a literary scholar, could end working with, let's say, like high skilled techniques in the age. So my first question to some of you is this one: what do the digital humanities mean to you? And you can maybe think 10 seconds now about the keywords or the sort of insights or yeah, like thoughts that this field mean for you. So according to a survey made by the University of Harvard, and they use Voyant, that this is one of the techniques that I guess that you are aware of, these were the positive terms that emerge when we ask this question, no? What does the term digital humanities mean to you? Technology, data, computer, research, data analysis, digital technology. And these were the negative terms that the people who replied to this survey response: unethical, discrimination, prejudice, bias, privacy, ethics, gender, and control, manipulation, and so on. So I will start my lecture, and I have been divided after this hook, about what does digital humanities mean, into different parts. First, I will give you some insights about digital humanities and translation history. And in the second part, I will show you different examples of my own research and the research that we have undertaken in the last year, since 2018, 2019, related to the ERC project that I was referring before. So I will read my first part, and then I will explain to you all the examples aloud. So in the last 20 years, digital humanities have made a splash among literary scholars, historians, and archaeologists. A growing community of researchers, particularly related to the above-mentioned fields, have largely reflected upon the digital turn and how this has represented an important shift in how we think about literature, cultural heritage, and historical phenomena. Digital editions of literary and historical works, especially relevant for the preservation of manuscripts from older times, the geospatial mapping of literary texts to explore spatial relationships between characters, historical buildings, places, and events, the mapping of literary works to understand which texts circulate and where they were published and translated, or the study of historical networks of authors, translators, and publishers have emerged as only a few examples of the engaging forms that digital humanities offer. These developments have been equally followed by sentimental analysis, the examination of themes, topics, style, word frequencies or collocations within the text, the implementation of natural language processing to address linguistic issues in relation to the past and to present societies, or the production of immersive experiences with digital content. Digital humanities as an academic field have been also relevant for digital art history, as in the work by Nuria Rodriguez Ortega and Beatrice Joyeux-Brunel, but also in media studies, as in the crucial publications by Lev Manovich. Within this general framework, let me briefly introduce digital humanities as an established field defined by multiple indicators of institutionalization that I will later compare to translation history. In the case of DH, signs of institutionalization include specific university programs in digital humanities, departmental and peers recognition, research centers and institutes, such as the Center of Digital Humanities at Princeton, jobs positions, chairs, and full professorships on digital humanities. A growing scholarly community has also promoted European, Asian, and international associations, for example, the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations or the Digital Humanities Association of Southern Africa, and has offered large opportunities for training and career development, such as doctoral and postdoctoral fellowships. There has been summer schools, as the one previously organized at the University of Victoria, now in Montreal, the European Summer School University in Digital Humanities, historically held in Leipzig, Germany, now in Besançon in France, or the Digital Humanities at the Oxford Summer School. Finally, I need to acknowledge an increasing number of publications and journals, such as the ones you have in the slide. For example, the Journal for Cultural Analytics, Digital Scholarship in the Humanities, or the most recent one, Journal of Historical Network Research. However, translation studies and translation history, more specifically, have only more recently aroused the interest of this academic community, despite being an object of research that clearly has huge potential for these methodologies. And I would like to show you this map that was proposed by Willard McCarthy and Harold Short already in 2006. And you will see here in the cloud that has the label of literature and the arts, how translation appeared. So at the earliest stages of digital humanities, translation was present. But what happened afterwards? Here in this other conceptual mark published in 2013, translation has disappeared. So in the specific case of translation history, it's only most recently that digital humanities and translation history were more interested one into the other one. Just also to give you a glimpse about the history of digital humanities, and I'm sure that you are all very aware of this, we may find the first milestone in 1946 with the Index Thomisticus by Roberto Busas, and we have seen over the years how the label of digital humanities have been changed, from humanities computing to computing humanities in the last few years, and other milestones such as like this companion to digital humanities in 2003, but also important journals in 2015, that now it has become the digital scholarship in the humanities journal. So these are the 4-branch classification of the age, and this is the definition of the age. So we can find digital humanities, computational humanities, the humanities of the digital, or more recently, public digital humanities. And my own research and the research that we have undertaken in our lab is related to the second one, and also maybe to the fourth one, and in terms of digital archives and open access and open social scholarship and digital archives also. So when it comes to digital translation history, an increasing number of publications have been trying to define the intersections between translation history and digital humanities. And we need to recognize translation history as interdisciplinary by nature, as it demands different theoretical and technical skills. Historically, translation history has borrowed concepts and methods from other disciplines, from sociology to linguistics, comparative literature, anthropology, gender and cultural studies, but also legal history, international relations and politics, and today also digital humanities. I have already reflected on the indicators showing the institutionalization of digital humanities as an established field, even though, as you are aware, digital humanities are not well represented all over the globe. So now let me now briefly turn into translation history as a growing domain that we anticipate will become more institutionalized. Over the last few years, there has been an increasing interest in establishing translation history as an independent field within the broad context of translation studies and/or comparative literature departments. To this end, I would like to highlight the emergence of specific conferences on translation history and associations exclusively related to translation history or other significant milestones related to a specialized training, a growing number of publications, and multiple databases on historical translations, as I will describe later. In the last few years, fundamental scientific events have been organized. For example, the History and Translation Network, with one of the last conferences taking place in Graz in September 2024, and summer schools on translation history, such as Translation in History, History in Translation, firstly held in Vienna, then also now in Graz, and the last edition in June 2025 had the topic of translation history and digital humanities for the first time, or an increasing number of publications and journals such as Chronotopos. And here in the slide, I have included one of our edited books, Cultural Soft Power, and there is also a special issue published in Perspectives in 2025 on translation and soft power, which shows this interdisciplinary that I was referring a few minutes ago. And in this case, and for those who are working in history, we have applied the term of soft power to culture and to translation more specifically. So translation, as I said, has become a growing field that is more and more institutionalized. And here you can see a few of the milestones that I was referring a few minutes ago. The History and Translation Network, and this summer school on translation in History and Translation that was devoted to digital humanities in June 2025. When it comes to digital translation history, as I said, there has been more and more literature in the last few years, since 2019, with the work by Judy Wakabayashi, but we have also proposed this term on big translation history in 2021 that I will refer to in a few minutes. And this book with Philip Hoffeneder, who was also giving a seminar in November, if I'm not mistaken, on digital translation history. So in these theoretical discussions, my colleagues have reflected upon what digital humanities can offer to translation practices, histories, and theories, and you can find the work by my colleague James Sanandre, who also works here in Hong Kong, Judy Kawayashi, as I was mentioning before, but also by Lynn Bowker, Raluca Tănăsescu, Dolmaya, and also Hilary Brown and other colleagues for early modern translation. Then the conceptual framework of big translation history, and I will talk about it a little bit later, and also other references like the one by René Desjardins and Philippe Lacour on the age translation automatization and the challenges of artificial intelligence. We can also find another cluster of works related to the identification of networks of translation, for example, the work by Raluca Tănăsescu, or also the age translation and gender, and I will show a few examples on this a little bit later, and also other references related to translation metadata and library catalogs, bibliometric analysis, translation flows, and in this respect, we have largely worked along these lines, and also larger scale research in translation history. And I would like to mention the forthcoming book, collective volume by Lieven Dulst and Yves Gambier. So now I would like to mention a few intersections and themes between translation history and digital humanities. Firstly, translation, the age and the archive. And in this respect, you can find different insights related to the creation, curation, and the use of digital or not archives. And as you may know, also for historians, literary scholars, and those scholars working with translation, there are many archives that have not been digitized. And of course, this is a challenge because we need to do it manually, or we need to rely on letters that can be scanned also manually. So there are also other potential and real biases in relation to the availability of data, and this is particularly important in relation to data related to women and to minoritized communities, because for many spaces, geographical and linguistic spaces, we don't have this data, is missing or partial. So this is also a challenge that we need to tackle. Also, the selection of tools and visualization techniques have provided abundant literature, and we can find, and I will only name a few of them, Guayan, Python, Carto, Palladio, or Gephi for social network analysis, and Cytoscape, and also, of course, text encoding initiative. Another theme that have been the object of research for translation studies scholars working on translation history and the age is how to publish and disseminate our data, and also in terms of preservation and standards. And we are trying to propose standards that can be useful for the whole community. Another theme is, of course, the data management plan, which means how to identify our sources and how to ask permissions, and also issues related to the design, the gathering, the cleaning, and the analysis of suitable data sets for exploring our data. And finally, issues related to the four principles that I'm sure you are aware of, and also, more importantly, to the core principles. And I would like to remind that the core principles were approved in 2017 in Botswana, and they aimed at protecting the data that is related to indigenous communities in terms of control, authority, responsibility, and ethics. And this means that we don't appropriate this data by applying extractivist practices that have been unfortunately have been lasted for a long time, but we recognize that this data belongs to the indigenous communities, and they have the sovereignty of this data and the control and the authority to disseminate or not their data. So the core principles are becoming more and more important, and I've been trying to implement them also in my own research. So other themes that I would like to highlight, and you will understand why, because I will show you a few examples related to these issues, are how we are applying in translation history data feminist and feminist data visualization. And this is important because, as I was mentioning before, in many of our historical research, we have real challenges and biases in terms of data related to women translators, for example, or related to archives that involve women writers. So this is why I'm proposing, some other colleagues like Catherine Dignazio and Laura Klein in the slide who have worked on data feminism, but also related to translation, race, social justice, and digital humanities, in the sense that we need also to think carefully how to depict and to describe and translate the otherness. And I can recommend you Translation and Rights by Corinne Taktiris. And of course, this is also related to intersectional theory and all the work that has been already published, not only in the United States in relation to intersectionality, but also in other parts of the world and in Latin America more precisely. And this is the area that I have more expertise in. There are many colleagues who have been working on translation, gender, and race. Another research line that I would like to highlight in relation to translation history and the age is queer digital scholarship that has also produced an increasing sample of scholarship, and also, of course, digital humanities and postcolonial studies, and more precisely in relation to translation history, the age in non-Western, non-English environments, but also in relation to digital humanities in the Global South. And I will give you an example later of one of my current PhD students who is a brilliant colleague from Nigeria. Finally, I would like to highlight two other challenges related to DH and translation and multilingualism. And this is particularly relevant for those colleagues who work in translation and periodicals, because as you know, in periodicals, we can find many different languages. And it's a challenge to work and to identify translations in periodicals, but it's also more challenging to work with different languages, especially when they offer different alphabets. And also in terms of translation and multimodal data, which means also involving audiovisual translation. So all these intersections and topics that I was mentioning can be summarized in 10 challenges and gaps that I would like to recap quickly. So the most important challenges and gaps that me, as someone who is working with translation history and DH for already a long time, and that I think that we still need to face are the following ones. The first one, how to balance significant inequalities in terms of applying digital methods both geographically and technologically. Then how to apply digital tools to disciplinary fields such as translation studies and translation history more specifically, and how to choose the most suitable methods that I would like to add that, of course, they are related to your research questions. So it's very important that first you think, what's my research question? What's my hypothesis? What I want to research? And then you think, what's the most suitable method for these research questions? And not the other way around, because it's not a matter of using one specific method, but a matter of concluding if this method is appropriate for your research question. Third, how to produce databases, infrastructures, online collections, and repositories that can be reused and reprocessed. Fourth, how to promote digital editions of translations, including advanced searches and multimedia content, as well as the analysis of paratext with data-driven approaches. And this is still a very nice research avenue to undertake. Fifth, how to face the collection, preprocessing, analysis, and publication of data in ways that are feasible and respectful with both fair and care principles, as I was referring a few minutes ago. Six, how to choose the appropriate tools for data visualization, and my colleague Philip Hoffeneder was talking about this in his seminar in November. Seventh, how to overcome the potential biases we encounter in terms of existing sources and biased data, as it occurs, as I was saying before, with missing or partial data and archives related to women and minoritized communities. Then how to deal with epistemological questions such as what constitutes a translation in historical terms when compiling databases or bibliographies, and how digital translation historians combine quantitative and qualitative analysis in a way that respects both depth, scale, and a wide and inclusive geographical scope, as well as a long-durée approach in broader terms, or how to face the silence of the archives. And I forgot to mention before this book, The Silence of the Archives, that I was presenting in the slide, and it's very interesting if you want to take a look at it. And finally, the two last ones, how can our scholarly community advance towards standards collaboration and data modeling, as well as towards more inclusive and egalitarian translation history, but not only. And I think that this challenge also implies all of you who may come from different backgrounds. And the last challenge I would like to highlight is related to the ethical dimensions and limitations of digital humanities in translation studies and translation history versus the fundamental challenges that have emerged with the impact of artificial intelligence. So, as announced before, it has also become commonplace to say that digital methods have become firmly established in the humanities in general. However, this is only partly true, as on the one hand, the widespread emergence of AI has significantly altered the scope and application of these methods, and once again, and on the other hand, there also exist significant inequalities, as I was saying a few minutes ago, in terms of applying digital methods as well as regarding access and production of digital documents. Indeed, data-driven approaches to translation history have scarcely been developed in many geographical areas in Africa, Latin America, or even in some parts of Asia, and they have not been sufficiently applied to the analysis of cultural relations and agents of translation as an area of research. In other words, there are many debates on the future of translation as a profession and on the specific tools for machine translation or computer-assisted translation, but digital humanities methods and data visualization are still scarcely applied in many parts of the world as part of the research process when it comes to uncover patterns and networks or analyze translation historical phenomena. At the same time, I need to remind that low threshold solutions are clearly coming to the fore, and there are solutions that do not need automatically require programming skills. So now to finish this first part, I would like to refer to this conceptual framework that we have proposed initially with my colleague Laura Folica in 2021, and we have proposed this term of big translation history that was inspired by Tim Hitchcock, historian, in 2013. And as translation historians, we are still thinking small, but what we have proposed here is that we have now the chance and the opportunity to think big. And this is why we define our conceptual framework, big translation history, as a methodology and a conceptual framework involving large-scale research, both geographically but also chronologically, and I could even add nowadays in 2026 linguistically in terms of multilingualism, then including massive data, and this means big data but also little data, which in our humanities, in the humanities, involves a wide range of often heterogeneous and non-structured sources, because of course we could also largely discuss what big data means for us as humanists. And finally, the use of computational techniques as part of the research process rather than only for visualization purposes. And I refer to this book, well-known book by Joanna Drucker, Visualization and Interpretation. So the core question here is how can we move from individual observations to more general beliefs about the world? And this is why we have proposed this conceptual framework in translation history and in translation studies more broadly. And within the years, in my own research, as we were also working with digital methods, with Philipp Hoffeneder, we are about to publish, and it will come very soon, this book, Digital Translation History. And in this book, we have compiled different chapters of well-known colleagues, and we have identified 4 research avenues. The first one is related to translation flows and the circulation of translated text. The second one is the analysis of translators working with data-driven approaches. Then the textual analysis of translations, and as I said, digital editions of translations are still a gap. So if some of you are working on translation, I would highly recommend you to propose digital editions of translations because there are not many of them. And finally, digital infrastructures and working environments such as repositories. So our book is divided into these 4 big clusters because these are the clusters that we have identified that our colleagues in translation history and digital humanities are working in a more extensive way. And now I will like to give you a few examples, but just let me precise that in my own research, I've been working mainly in 3 of these 4 clusters: in translation flows and the circulation of translated text, in the analysis of translators, and finally in the last cluster on digital infrastructures and working environments. So now I will go to the second part of my lecture, and I will give you a few examples of my own research and the research that I've been undertaking with my colleagues, and they are former PhD students who work with me and also postdoctoral fellows. And I will start with these examples. I will show you many of them. So my advice here would be that don't stay in the concrete example, but try to think how this example can be applied and can be inspiring, hopefully, to your own research and to your own research questions. So I will give you many examples related to the Latin American and to the Spanish and Lusophone speaking world, but again, the purpose of these examples is that they become appealing for you that may work in the Chinese context, for example, or in the Chinese context related to maybe the Korean or Japanese or other Asian languages and historical frameworks. So here, I would like to ask you, what is this? Maybe can you guess? I don't know if someone wants to open the microphone and tell me what is this, if you can guess. Anyone? No? Okay. So it's not a planet, it's not a smiley face, but this is the catalog of the Spanish National Library in Madrid. So what we did, it was to download all the metadata of the Spanish National Library. So these are all the books and all the metadata related to publishers, translators, printers, and people who wrote a preface and so on that we can find on the Spanish National Library. So anyone can guess, like this green spot, what does it mean in the Spanish National Library catalog? Anyone that is brave enough to dare? I cannot see the chat, so I'm not sure if anyone is writing in the chat, because as I'm sharing my screen, I'm not. Okay, let me see. But I'm not sure if, well, yeah. Okay, so yeah, this is the Don Quixote's constellation, the Spanish, that it appears here. So this means that this is the book that has that has produced more metadata in the Spanish National Library. The second green spot that you have a little bit above, it belongs to two playwriters who were very popular at the 19th century. They were two brothers, and they published many theatrical works. So this is another work and another author in this case that has produced lots of metadata. So as you can imagine, with this graph, we can produce and we can offer many insights, but I will only give you a different angle, and this is the 15 most translated authors according to the Spanish catalog from the Spanish National Library. And there are no surprises, because you can find Shakespeare, Oscar Wilde, Isa de Queiroz, who was a Portuguese author, Balzac, many French authors, but also Russian, such as Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or Maxim Gorky. And there are no women, no? So as you could see. So in relation to women, I would like to give you a second example of our own research, and this is related to what I was mentioning before regarding data feminism and intersectionality. Here we published some work on Victoria Ocampo, who was an Argentinian woman. She was very well known as a writer, but also as a publisher. She was the publisher of Sur, South in English. That was a journal, but also a publishing house. And through her correspondence, and I'm saying this for those who are working with correspondences, we could find very interestingly that she wrote more letters with men. So this means that the letters that she wrote with men are more abundant, but the number of letters that she wrote with women is higher. So this means that the solidarity and the networks that she established with women was stronger compared than with men. That in the case of men, there is a larger range of letters, but there are more abundant, and the frequency with in letters with women was stronger. And this is also very interesting from a different perspective that the slide doesn't show, but I would like to mention it. That is related to the role of other women who were more invisible in the public sphere. In the case of Victoria Campo, we can explore her correspondence because it's well documented and she has a foundation in Buenos Aires. But in the case of other women, we have lost the correspondences of these other women, or there is partial or missing data. So the fact that these women appear in the correspondence of Victoria Campo already gives very important insights in terms of the significance of these women. So this means that we can infer through the correspondence of Victoria Campo that these other women also played an important role in the public sphere. So it's not, I would say that from the data feminist perspective, you can not only explore those women for which we can have data, we can have an archive, but also you can trace the relevance of other women that appear in these networks. I hope I'm clear enough, but I can clarify any issue afterwards. So just to give you a few other examples, you can find nowadays many collaborative places and platforms that work on that try to produce gender data. So if you are working with gender perspectives in the case of the Chinese context, I'm sure that in China there are also other examples. And if you don't them, I would strongly encourage you to create them because they are very needed, like gender data labs. And in Wikipedia and also in Wikidata, there are also wiki projects for tracing the role of women. And you can find here an example of related to women translators. And you can also do some queries related to other professions that you might be interested, as you can see at the bottom part of the slide, in terms of writers, critics, historians, authors, children's writers, and so on, all related to women. So now I would like to jump into a different sort of examples. And as I said, you might remember that in our forthcoming book, Digital Translation History with Philip Hoffeneder, we have identified these 4 different large research avenues. So I would like to give you now a few examples related to translation flows and translated text in circulation. And in this case, translation history and digital humanities is also related to what has been called as geo-humanities, which means mapping literature and translation in space. So I will give you in the following slide an example of the work by my current PhD student, Henry John Chukwudi. I was mentioning him before. He's from Nigeria and he belongs to the Global Literary Studies Research Lab. But here I would like to mention these books, Working on Africa, Oxford Street, Accra, and Imagine Lagos. And what they do is to map literature in space. So this means that they examine how literature has been represented in the case of Lagos or in the case of Accra. So this means to analyze the meanings, the memories, and symbolism surrounding locations, places, and monuments in a corpus of novels and translations, but also the multiple layers of meanings that are related to different places, real or invented. For example, a place for lovers, a religious site, or a site of executions. And this is important because if we are trying to apply a postcolonial perspective to our research, there are many places that were destroyed by colonial forces, and this is why it's very important to rebuild those places that appear in novels and that they don't exist anymore. So fiction and literary works can give us some hints of places that were destroyed fires, but that they are still alive in the memories and in the of the society, no? And in this case, is related to Lagos in Nigeria or to Accra, but it can be also applied to other parts of the world. So this is the work by Henry Lichtek Lagos. Here, as I said, he's in his PhD, he's exploring how different sites and different memories and meanings of Lagos are represented in a sample of books from Chinua Achebe to Chimamanda or other Nigerian authors. Benokri also, just to give you a few examples. This is another example of one of my former PhD students, Anna Vrikeshvili, and she was working on the translation of Georgian literature. She is originally from Georgia into other languages, and I will try to show you that this is working. Yes. So what she was doing here, it was the other way around. Instead of tracing how a place is represented in literature, she was tracing how translations were circulating throughout the world. So in this case, what she found, her work is very rich, and you can also take a look at her thesis dissertation, is how Georgian literature has been translated, and she could find that Germany has played an important role historically, but in the last few years, and of course Russia, but in the last few years there has been more and more interperipheral relations in translation between Georgia and other countries around Georgia, such as Armenia or Turkey. So it's very interesting how, when we explore translation flows throughout the years and in the long durée, retrieving Bernard Brodal's term, we can see how these translation flows are evolving and they change. And of course, the role of Russia in relation to how Georgian literature was circulated changed significantly after 1989. So now I would like to give you another example, and this is related to translation in periodicals, and this has been related to the previous ERC grant that I was mentioning at the very beginning, this very large project that I got in 2018, and it started in 2019. And in this case, I was trying to identify translations in periodicals, more specifically in periodicals between 1898 and 1959, and in Iberoamerica, which means Spain, Portugal, and Latin America, including Brazil. And I chose these two dates because 1898, it's the date of the loss of the last colony, in this case Cuba, by the Spanish Empire, and 1959 is the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. And these two dates are very meaningful for the Spanish-speaking world, so this is why I chose them to propose this research. So to do that, we were trying to select sources, and of course this is a very important part, how to select and how to identify the right sources. And we, of course, as I said before, many sources are not digitized, and when you work with periodicals, this is even worse, as you may know, if you are familiar with this specific field. So we have selected those repositories that have already digitized important samples of periodicals. And in terms of Spain, Portugal, and America, we found that the only repositories that have digitized samples of periodicals are the following ones: the one related to the Spanish library, the Spanish National Library, the one related to Portugal, Chile, Uruguay, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. And you have here the logos of these repositories. Then a second source that we have used to do this large-scale research is related to a few repositories that were produced by institutions or by projects. No? For example, here you may find the historical archive of Argentinian journals, but also an Uruguayan research project that is called Anaphoras. And in this project, my Uruguayan colleagues, they already digitized a significant sample of periodicals. And the same goes for Revista de Ideas y Cultura in Portugal or Edad de Plata in the case of Madrid. So just to give you, like some parallels that you can apply in your own research. So if you want to examine translations in periodicals, you can work with repositories, say, published by the Chinese National Library or by specific institutions. For example, I'm not sure about the Confucius Institute, but maybe they have some digitized periodicals, but also other big institutions in other parts of China, or specific projects related to a university or related to private research institutions. So just to give you some numbers about this research, we were working with almost 400 journals, and you have here the numbers related to issues, articles, and authors. And as we were interested in translators, and also more specifically in women translators, we found that only 193 translators were identified. Of course, this doesn't mean that all translators that publish a translation in these journals were mentioned as such, because as you know, for historical periods, translators were not professionalized. In many cases, their names didn't appear or they appeared in pseudonyms. So these are the only ones that are explicitly mentioned, but still, compared to the authors that we have found, the number is very low, which is also significant. So now I will show you a few visualizations related to this research. And for example, here you can find contemporary translations in a sample of literary journals from Barcelona and Buenos Aires. And I cannot go now into the details, but if we could get into every note, you can see first, the large geographical scope of the place of birth of these authors, because each note means the author that has been translated into this sample of journals from Barcelona and Buenos Aires. So you can already see that the geographical scope is very large. And also, I would like to mention that these authors were, most of them, contemporary, which means that this idea that has been proposed about innovative centers and imitative peripheries, let's say like the literary canon passed through Paris, Berlin, and London at this time. I'm talking between the end of the 19th century and 1959. Maybe was not fully true when we undertake this large-scale research, and we realized that many of these authors were already translated before the English and French translations, or even German, into, for example, Spanish. So this is very meaningful because, as I said, it nuances this hypothesis of innovative centers and imitative peripheries. Maybe Latin America, that has been considered historically a periphery, it's not a periphery as such, because as I show in this graph, the number of translation into Spanish and into Catalan, because some of these journals from Barcelona are published in Catalan, was already very high. Just to give you a concrete example, the first excerpt of La Métamorphose by Kafka was translated into Spanish before than English and French. Also, the first translation of the complete works by Freud was also translated into Spanish and not into English and French. So this is just to give you a few examples of how large-scale research and empirical research can nuance and can add significant insights to what we already know. So this is another example related to this large-scale research we did on translations in periodicals. And in this respect, what we were interested is in exploring what sort of the place and language of publication and origin of Portuguese-speaking authors in a sample of Latin American journals, in this case, Sur, Alfar, and Boletín Titicaca. And we were interested in doing this because we were exploring translation practices, and what we could find is that in those journals that were more closer to the coast, for example, Alfar and Sur, that they are published in Montevideo and Buenos Aires, all original works from Portuguese were translated into Spanish because they had more access to translators. But in those journals, such as Boletín Titicaca, that is in the countryside or in the mountains, there was no translation, and Portuguese-speaking authors were published in original. So here you can see different translation practice in terms of how translation works in publications that were published in big cities or in the coast, and translations published in periodicals that were published in the mountains or in the countryside. And I'm sure that you can find very interesting conclusions if you explore translations in periodicals in Beijing or in big cities like Hong Kong or Shanghai, and those translations in periodicals that have been published in other parts of mainland China. So here you have a similar example, in this case for Spain and Portugal, and it's also related to the place and language of publication and origin of Portuguese-speaking writers in a journal published in Catalan, in La Revista, and in a journal published in Madrid, La Gaceta Literaria, in a journal published in Alfar, in La Coruña, which is in Galicia. And here we find three different models. In the case of the journal that is published in Catalan, all Portuguese-speaking writers were translated into Catalan because at this time translators and publishers in Barcelona were trying to institutionalize Catalan as a literary language, so they need translations. In the case of Madrid, we find 0.5%, so 50% of authors are translated into Spanish and the other 50% are published in original language. This means in Portuguese. And in the case of Alfar, as this journal was published in Galicia, and in Galicia they speak Galician, that is a very similar language to Portuguese, for some people a dialect, for others a language, so they didn't translate them. So you can see different, again, translation practices when you explore translations in periodicals, and different levels of multilingualism and different levels of translation or not. Here, related also to the same journals that I was mentioning before in the table, so what we explore are translation flows in relation to languages and translation zones, no? And here you can see these translation zones that I was proposing for this research: Andes, the Andean Mountains, Rio de la Plata, the Caribbean, Mexico, and others, non-identified or not very representative. And you can see how these languages, French, German, Catalan, Portuguese, Italian, English, Russian, other languages, are related to different countries, because of course we could find periodicals from Paris and from Brussels that are published in French, but they belong to two different countries, and the same goes for English in the case of United Kingdom or the United States. So if we go more in detail, we were interested in seeing what languages are translated in these journals, and in this case I would like to give you a glimpse about the importance of migrants communities, because, for example, in these Ibero-American, Spanish, and Lusophone journals, we could find a significant number of translations also from Catalan literature. And we thought, why this happens, no? Or from Galician. Well, so this is important, like in contextual terms, because the Catalan community of migrants, both in Buenos Aires but also in La Habana, was very significant. So this is why we could find this, not like meaningful number percentage of Catalan translators, of Catalan translations, sorry. And you can find also other languages in case you are curious, also Chinese, but very little. Finally, in terms of gender, we also explore what was the gender presence, in terms of women and men. And we don't have, as of course this is an historical research, we don't have data in relation to non-binary identities, but I would say that for those of you who work with contemporary periods, this is important. And in my current project that I think that I won't have time to present, but maybe this could be for another lecture, we are trying to also to disaggregate the data in terms of gender, but also in terms of non-binary data. So here in the slide, you can see the percentage of women, both writers and translators, that are represented in these journals, and the higher number is related to Mexican periodicals. So for the gender bias and to identify to gender identification, just to let you know, we have worked with BIAF and also with Wikidata, and here you have the same example of Victoria Campo. And in the case of BIAF, we could find the gender, because when you work with the metadata of many libraries, the gender field is empty, so we don't have this information. So to disaggregate the data between, in terms of gender, I would recommend you to work with BIAF or with Wikidata depending on your research. So this is another example of a different research not related to periodicals, and now I'm jumping to the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation for those who are working in history. And this was, just to say it very quickly, the former UNESCO, one of the institutes that precede UNESCO. So we were working with the archives that are kept in Paris in the UNESCO headquarters. And here with my colleague, Rubén Rodríguez Casán, we published a book chapter in gender perspective on the history of intellectual cooperation and in terms of women at the League of Nations and the Paris Institute. And we were trying to disaggregate female and male related to professions. So you can see a higher number of women related to library and documentation, secretarial and clerical job positions, personal assistants, and so on, and a higher number of male related to international delegates and reporters in positions related to leadership and administration, management and executive, and general members, etc. So these are the sort of documents that we were working with in relation to the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation. And I would like to show you this sample of letters, because of course this is one of the challenges also for the OCR and also for those who work with correspondence and with multilingualism, because in this case we found letters written in different languages, and also the fact of typewritten and handwritten, which is also a challenge for OCR. And here you can find the language used in these institutional documents that I was referring. And this is the work of my former colleague, former PhD student, Elizabeth Carbó Catalán, who was also working in this large European project. And you can see how French in the first years will give more place to English throughout the years. And of course, this is aligned with what is happening nowadays, that French was surpassed by English. And here we also find another example related to the documentation of the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation. And this was a paper that we published in 2024 with my colleagues Alessio Cardillo, Javier Borge, Rubén Rodríguez, and Elizabeth Carbo Catalán. And this is related to the place of origin of these letters. So we would like to see what was the international relations of these countries, now in terms of the place of origin of the people who were writing these letters. So here you can see that Switzerland and France, because the headquarters of the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation was in Paris and the headquarters of the League of Nations were in Geneva, are the most abundant. And then we thought, what happens if we delete those letters that come from France and Switzerland to show different clusters? So this is what happens. And I'm showing this example because this can be also very maybe enlightening for you. When you have, when you work with a large correspondence, and maybe you can see that there is a cluster that may overshadow other clusters, my advice would be to delete this cluster for a moment to see how other clusters may emerge. So this is what happened in these two cases, no? That first, this is the slide of the graph, including those letters that were written in France and Switzerland that were the most abundant, and this is what happened. What happens when we delete these clusters for a moment, and there are other clusters that may appear, no? And some of them, for example, the cluster number 6 is very interesting and very obvious, but it was very good that we eliminate those letters coming from France and Switzerland, because we could see other clusters, such as the cluster number 6 related to Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland, which means that there was more correspondence among these countries, which is, as I said, an obvious conclusion, but we couldn't see it until we delete the first letters from Switzerland and France. So this is an EGO network related to Elena Sancinena de Lizalde, who was a major figure in Argentina. And this is another sort of visualizations that we have produced. And here you can see her relationships with La Revista Sur, but also with Amigos del Arte, which was an association through which she invited many speakers, many international figures to Buenos Aires to give lectures, and also to the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation, as I was mentioning before. So just to give you an example of other potential analysis that you can do if you work, for example, with a major figure, with a translator, with a writer, or with other individual figures. And some final thoughts that I would like to give. We need to move away from this faith in exhaustivity, because we are only analyzing a part of the literary system or a part of any system that you are exploring. So when you work with translation and digital humanities, you work more in terms of representativity than in terms of exhaustivity, as traditional literary scholars were used to work. Then in selecting data, interpretation is implied, so you need to ask yourself why select this data and not the other one. And there is always a bias in any selection, and all data sets have limitations. So my advice always to all my PhD students and in all lectures that I'm giving the slides is be critical, and you don't need to rely on your data. Your data is an indicator, but it doesn't represent the whole reality. So the analysis is not a historical and bibliographical alone, and this is why I was giving you the example of the migrant communities, because if I'm not an expert in the period or in the context, my data doesn't explain anything. So this is why in the case of the migrant example, I can tell you that the translations from Catalan or Galician literatures that we may find, they are related with an historical event, that is the fact that many that there was a large migrant community from Catalan origins, both in Buenos Aires and Cuba. So you need to be critical and interpretative, and any analysis requires a context. So another final thought that I would like to remind you is that the correspondence between data and fact is not always obvious. So this is why you need to have expertise on data-driven approaches, but also in the historical concepts and in the historical context that you are exploring. And again, the data emanating from digitized libraries doesn't mean everything, because of course, as you know, not everything has been digitized, and there are also legal limits to digitalization, and not all libraries have digitized their texts and archives. So this is why sometimes you need to complement these sources with other sources, as I was showing before, for example, related to projects that have already digitized periodicals or other institutions. So in many cases, there is no information on the reading of these texts, so we cannot relate publication with readership. And this is also very important for translation and literary historians, because we know very little about readership, especially for historical periods. Another final thought is in terms of open access is that I would encourage you to share your files. And in the case of our data, we have published our data in Cora, which is the repository of our university, but also there are many data sets. You can also work in a Looker Studio, which is very good also for sharing data sets and for opening your data. So nowadays, and of course, there are also Zenodo or GitHub for those who are more skilled. And the final thought is that digital approaches may reinforce the knowledge divide because funding is unequal and there are still many inequalities. So I would like to highlight these inequalities and to strongly encourage you to take into account all the biases that we are introducing when we work with data and when we work with minoritized communities, for example, with indigenous languages and literatures, which is the object of research of my future European project. And this is something that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. So these are So these are some works that we have published in the last 3 years. And I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to reply to all the questions and comments you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Diana, for that really wide-ranging presentation. So we have a little bit of time still for questions. And I encourage students to type their questions in the chat. I see we have a couple have arrived already. But maybe while the students are typing, I'll ask a sort of initial question. And I wonder, how has, I guess, the sort of deep learning and larger AI revolution of the last couple of years affected the work of your lab? How has it kind of, increased your productivity, changed your modes of analysis, or any other changes? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, thanks for your question. Yes, of course, this is very relevant, but in my lab, and maybe because, I've been working a lot with Latin American colleagues, we try to work also on, or we try to defend minimal computing. And because, as I said, there are many low-threat solutions that can be implemented. And maybe we try to work on also as activism, because, for example, in my next European project, I will work with indigenous communities from Mexico and Brazil. And of course, there are many inequalities in terms of the data that you can gather also in the Global South. And this is why I've been also working with African scholars. So this is why I'm a little bit reluctant to fully develop large training models of generative AI and so on. This doesn't mean that, of course, we have used AI in terms of natural language processing, for example. So AI is there. and also in terms of machine learning. But we try to be very critical about the sort of AI that we are using. So this is what I could say, no? But it's also related, related to our geographical area of expertise, and we think that it's better to do it in this way, and that we need to be very critical.
Great. So I don't know if can you see the chat as well?
Yes, I
I
can
just
see
want to
now
make
because
sure.
I have,
So you see there's there are a number of questions. I'm happy to read them out. So we have a question from a PhD student, Esteban Ramirez Gonzalez. Thank you for the wide overview with many practical examples. There seems to be rich evidence in mapping networks of translation and geolocation. When it comes to researching and theorizing these practices with the substance, changing meanings, borrowing, sciencing, particularly with non-literal translations, where do you see the current debates, key voices, and best practices? Gracias.
Okay, so let me read it again. When it comes to researching, well, I would say that the current debates and the key voices and best practice are related to some of the insights that I was already proposing. For example, and this applies also for non-literary translations, no? Because this is something that it works similarly. But I would say that in many cases, first, the awareness about this silence is already something that we need to highlight more and more. And then also the awareness of in maybe inferring some gaps through other, no, as the example that I was showing related to Victoria Ocampo, how the research on hair can help us to unearth other voices that were silenced, no? So I would say that there are some practices like in terms of inferring, no, other voices that were overshadowed. Also, there are many translators that have been overshadowed, and for example, this can be also very relevant. And there are some translators that were also diplomats, and this is the case for China too. And I know a few examples on this. So maybe these voices can be also somehow highlighted.
So we have a question here from Colin. Thank you for your wonderful talk. I'm particularly curious about your big translation history projects, framework, and insights. What practical challenges or opportunities do you see in scaling or applying this framework of big translation history to the Asian or Chinese translation context? For example, I wonder whether the OCR challenges with sources might be even greater in such contexts. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the framework of big translation history can be fully applied to the Asian and Chinese translation context, because indeed, when we propose this term and when we have been working with data-driven approaches, my case study is the Latin American Spanish-speaking context, but the conceptual and the theoretical insights are valid for everything, in this case for all geographical and linguistic spaces, no? Because as I said, it involves big data, but also little data, which also applies to the Asian and Chinese translation context, because of course, you may have some digitized sources, but you may have other sources that are not digitized. So in this respect, you need to work with both, like digitized sources and sources that can be manually, collected. So it applies the same. And also in terms of this large scale, both geographically and over time. And this is why I was proposing to apply the concept of longue durée by Fernand Braudel to my translation history, but this can be applied perfectly to the Asian and Chinese translation context. And also the fact of using visualizations not as the result, but as part of the process, no? And so, because of course, in the process, you can get many insights from these visualizations. In terms of the OCR, of course, there are challenges specifically related to Chinese and also to other Asian languages. But I'm not an expert in the Chinese context, but I'm aware that many colleagues and that there has been a very important work to overcome these challenges. So I would say that in the next few years, and in this respect, AI can be useful for that. So we will have an OCR that is that the error ratio is less and less significant, no? And in just maybe very briefly, in case this is useful for the case of our own research, we would say that 75-80% of success in the case of OCR was meaningful for us, no? Because if not, the error would be too high. So this is, like we were working along these lines, no, in terms of percentage.
Makes sense. So maybe we'll jump down a little bit and ask. This is Chen Qiming. How can digital humanities approaches address the temporal and procedural aspects of translation history, such as delays between original publication and translation, revisions, retranslations over decades, or shifts in translation policies under different political systems?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important question too. And okay. So, for example, there are some methods from digital humanities that they don't address the temporal aspects. For example, in the case of social network analysis, we can see the connections between people, but we cannot see know in what periods these connections were made. So this is, this is somehow like a pitfall of social network analysis. But when you work with translation flows and mapping, you can see these temporal aspects of translation history. And if you work in the long durée, this can be done. So either you have, like more or less a team that you can, of course, work together. Or, for example, if you work on your own, you can work on a specific figure, a specific translator, and explore his translations, his or her translations, and his connections throughout his life. So this is something that can be also, that it's feasible to do, no? But in the case of delays between original publication and translation, yeah, you can map it, but for example, in the example that I was showing related to these contemporary authors, as I was mapping the date of birth, and you can map the date of the original of this work. If you also map the date of the translation, you could see the difference if there is a large gap or if there is not, if the gap is not very meaningful. So this is something that can be done. And the same for revisions and retranslations over decades, if you have the data, of course, because and in the case of China, I'm also aware that because I had Yehua Chen, that was a former PhD student that she was previously in Taiwan, and now she changed university, and she didn't work on digital humanities, but she worked on the translations of Latin American authors into Chinese. And she also saw that there were many translations that were pirate. I'm not sure about this word in English.
Pirated, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. So yes, in depending on the context, you will find additional challenges. For example, as in this case. And translation policies, this is precisely the object of my current project. That is, I'm trying to explore cultural diversity in translation in the translations that have been funded by National Institute of Cultures in the whole Iberoamerica, in Spain, Portugal, and Latin America. No, like for example, the ones given by the Confucius Institute or by the Korean Literary Institute, and I've been trying to see what sort of gender diversity, bibliodiversity, and also in terms of politics, political systems, And this is very interesting because, for example, in this particular case, we have seen, and this current project is for contemporary period from 2001 to 2022. So for this specific case, we have seen how the translations that were granted by Programa Sur, which is the program funding translations in Argentina, dropped significantly when Milei was in power, no, the current Argentinian president. So for those countries no, mm, that have experienced, let's say, less democratic governments, no, or governments that are more unstable, so we can see very significant changes in terms of translation policy, no? Because political systems and governments, the change of governments affect significantly the amount of translations that are supported for translation. So yes, my answer would be yes, because we are already seeing this in my current project that is comparing how transitions are supported in these different programs in Latin America, Spain, and Portugal.
Mhm. Right, so I think we have time for maybe one more question. I don't know if there's a question you want to end with.
Okay,
There, you can have a look.
just to make okay, just because we don't have time. This is my. I guess you didn't. Yeah, this is my email, and those of you who have more questions, I'm happy to reply to them. You can write to me, and if you take pictures of the presentation, I would kindly ask you to cite the presentation, and you can also find my work and the work of my colleagues published. So let me see, you know, okay, and by focusing. Yeah, okay. Yes. Do you think there is a risk that PH projects, by focusing on what is easily countable? Yeah, that's also a good question. Risk away from reception and reading practices altogether. Yes, I would say that at the current stage, as I said, we have many databases on translation, no, many databases on translated text, and there are increasingly on the work of translators, but there are less on digital editions of translations. So this is why it's interesting to maybe to balance, no, this this is if possible. And in terms of reading practices, as I said, the data related to readership is very low in historical terms, but it's also difficult even now, no? I mean, we can find more data, but still it's difficult. And the same goes for reception, because reception can be endless. For example, I don't know, the reception of Moyan, the translations by Moyan, no? So yeah, it's difficult because of course with social media and like the media is very large, so it can be even difficult to gather all this data. But I think that yeah, it's a good comment, and I think you are right.
Wonderful. Okay, so I think it's now 5:30 in Hong Kong, so we're completely out of time. I want to take this opportunity to thank our speaker once again for the very engaging presentation, and to remind all of you in the audience that we'll be back next week for the final event in our series. So I look forward to seeing many of you next week. Thanks again,
Thank
Diana.
you, Stuart. Thank you. And yeah, I'm here, so write to me if yeah, I can be of any help. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. All right. Good afternoon, good evening, good
Good
night to
afternoon.
everybody. Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.